March 15, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany. The fog clung to the water like a shroud. American engineers worked in near silence, their breath-forming clouds and pre-dawn cold as pontoon boats scraped against the muddy eastern bank. The river moved slowly here, deceptively calm, its dark surface reflecting nothing but gray sky. Somewhere across that water, in the hills beyond, German machine gun nests waited. The smell of wet canvas and diesel fuel mixed with the earth. Fresh, cold, German earth. For the first time in this war, American boots would press deep into the industrial heart of the Reich itself. The Rhine, that ancient barrier between civilizations, that moat protecting the fatherland, was about to fall. Not in months, not in weeks. In 10 days, the entire southern front would collapse like a house built on sand. No one yet understood what was coming. Not the Wehrmacht commanders, studying their maps in concrete bunkers. Not the young Volkssturm conscripts clutching their rifles in flooded foxholes. Not even the American generals who authorized the crossing fully grasped the speed at which the German southern defensive line, the West Wall, the Siegfried Line, the interlocking fortifications built over a decade to prevent exactly this, would disintegrate. They expected weeks of brutal fighting. They planned for casualties in the tens of thousands. They prepared for another Hurtgen Forest, another Metz, another grinding advance measured in yards per day. Instead, they would witness something unprecedented in modern warfare, a complete systemic collapse of defensive line not through attrition, but through the overwhelming application of material abundance and operational tempo that German military doctrine had no answer for. The German High Command had built their southern strategy on historical precedent. Every invasion of Germany in modern history had stalled at the Rhine. The French in 1794 took months to force a crossing. Napoleon's marshals bled for every mile of German soil. The Allies in 1918 never crossed at all. The armistice came first. The river wasn't just water. It was psychology. It was identity. It was the last great natural barrier before the industrial corridor and the administrative heart of southern Germany lay exposed. Behind the Rhine stretched defensive works that represented the culmination of German military engineering, reinforced concrete pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery zones, minefields plotted to the meter. The West Wall, built in the 1930s as Hitler's answer to France's Maginot Line, consists of over 18,000 bunkers, tunnels, and tank traps stretching from Switzerland to the Netherlands. In the south, from Karlsruhe to Mannheim to Heidelberg, these fortifications have been updated throughout the war with bitter lessons learned on the Eastern Front. They were formidable. They were, on paper, nearly impregnable. But paper doesn't account for what the Americans brought with them. On the morning of March 15th, as those first assault boats pushed off on the western bank, German observers radioed back reports that defied belief. They described not battalions, but entire divisions crossing simultaneously at multiple points. They reported bridging equipment appearing in quantities that seemed logistically impossible. Within 6 hours of the first crossing, American engineers had constructed a pontoon bridge capable of supporting medium tanks. Within 12 hours, a second bridge stood 3 miles downstream. By nightfall on the first day, a heavy-duty treadway bridge designed to carry the entire weight of armored divisions was operational. The Americans weren't probing for weakness. They weren't establishing a foothold for future exploitation. They were pouring across like water through a broken dam, and they had no intention of stopping. German soldiers who had survived the Eastern Front, who had endured Stalingrad and Kursk, who thought they understood the limits of industrial warfare, stood in their positions and watched something that broke their comprehension of war itself. One Oberleutnant, captured on the third day of the offensive, told his interrogators, "We destroyed one of their bridges in the night. By morning, they had built 2 more. We knocked out their ammunition depot with artillery. By afternoon, 3 new depots appeared. We killed their forward observers. They sent up spotter planes. We shot down the planes. They called in radio-directed fire from guns we couldn't even see. It wasn't war. It was like fighting a factory." That phrase, fighting a factory, would appear again and again in German after-action reports and prisoner testimonies. It captured something essential about what was happening. The German military had always prided itself on operational excellence, on tactical brilliance compensating for material disadvantage, on the superiority of fighting spirit and battlefield initiative. Their entire operational doctrine since the 19th century had been built on defeating numerically superior enemies through superior maneuver, concentration of force at decisive points, and the cultivation of officer initiative at every level. It had worked against France in 1870, against Russia in 1917, against Poland and France in 1939 and 1940. But it had no answer for an enemy that could be everywhere in overwhelming strength simultaneously. An enemy that didn't need to choose which objective to prioritize because it had enough resources to pursue all objectives at once. By March 18th, just 3 days into the offensive, the Southern Front wasn't just cracking, it was evaporating. American armor punched through the west wall fortifications at Ludwigshafen, outflanking the entire defensive line, protecting Mannheim. Simultaneously, infantry divisions crossed at Worms, and motorized cavalry elements were already probing 30 miles inland, moving faster than German command could track them. The Wehrmacht had positioned its reserves to respond to a breakthrough, but the Americans achieved 6 breakthroughs simultaneously across a 100-mile front. German reserves rushed to plug one gap, only to discover 2 more had opened behind them. Communication lines collapsed. Orders became obsolete before they could be transmitted. Units found themselves isolated, surrounded, cut off from resupply, facing enemies who seemed to materialize from nowhere with unlimited ammunition and air support available on demand. The young Wehrmacht soldiers crouching in their bunkers, many of them teenagers drafted in the final desperate scraping of the barrel, had been told they were defending the fatherland. They had been told that the Rhine was sacred, that German soil would absorb the enemy, that the fortifications built by their fathers would hold. They clutched their weapons. Increasingly, these were obsolete rifles, captured equipment, even Great War era arms pulled from storage, and waited for the Americans to come. They expected a battle. They expected to fight and die in defense of their positions, to sell their lives dearly in the grand tradition, to prove that German soldiers never surrendered easily. What they experienced instead was silence, then thunder, then nothing. The American doctrine wasn't to assault fortifications directly if they could be bypassed. When they encountered a strong point, they didn't hurl infantry against it in costly frontal attacks. They radioed coordinates. Within minutes, fighter bombers would appear, Thunderbolts, Mustangs, dropping bombs and napalm with precision that seemed almost casual. If the weather prevented air support, artillery would speak instead. Mass batteries firing coordinates called in by forward observers who moved with the assault troops, or by liaison aircraft circling overhead in perfect safety because the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an operational force in the West. The shells would fall not for minutes, but for hours, systematic, methodical, turning concrete fortifications into rubble. Then, often, the Americans would simply move around position entirely, leaving it isolated and useless, its defenders facing a choice between staying in their hole until they starved or surrendering to an enemy that had already moved on. A ration tin became the symbol of this collapse, specifically the American sea ration. German soldiers, by March 1945, were subsisting on roughly 1,500 calories per day when supply lines functioned, considerably less when they didn't. Bread was increasingly made from sawdust and chestnut flour. Meat was a memory. The Wehrmacht logistics system, shattered by years of attrition and the loss of occupied territories, could barely keep ammunition flowing to front, let alone adequate food. Hunger was constant, gnawing, debilitating. It sapped strength, degraded judgment, eroded morale in ways no propaganda could counter. Then the Americans arrived, and with them came abundance that seemed to violate the laws of scarcity that had governed life in Germany for years. Every American soldier carried rations with him, not emergency provisions, but daily meals packaged in small tins, meat and beans, meat and hash, crackers, chocolate, cigarettes, instant coffee, sugar. Each ration pack contained more calories than a German soldier saw in 2 days, and they were disposable. Americans ate them and threw the tins away. German prisoners, processed through temporary camps in those first chaotic days, were fed from these same rations, more food in one sitting than many had seen in weeks. They sat in muddy fields, surrounded by guards, and ate until they felt sick, and still there was more. Supply trucks would arrive, enormous six-wheel vehicles, and unload pallets of these tins by the hundreds, by the thousands. One German NCO, a veteran of the Afrika Korps in the Eastern Front, captured near Heidelberg on March 20th, told his interrogator something that appeared in the intelligence summary. We could accept losing the war. We understood we were outnumbered. But this is something else. You don't just defeat us. You bury us in things. Every soldier has everything he needs. Always. You throw away in one day what would supply one of our companies for a week. You fight us with your factories, with your farms, with your entire nation. We fight you as soldiers. It's not the same war. It wasn't the same war. The American military in 1945 was less an army than an industrial system with soldiers at its tip. For every American combat soldier in Germany, 9 more worked in the supply chain behind him. The logistics operation that supported the Rhine crossing involved more vehicles than the entire Wehrmacht had possessed at the start of the war. Fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, replacement equipment. All of it flowed forward in quantities calculated not just to sustain operations, but to guarantee absolute material superiority at the point of contact. American doctrine didn't seek to outfight the Germans with superior tactics or fighting spirit. It sought to overwhelm them so completely that tactical excellence became irrelevant. By March 22nd, 7 days into the offensive, the German Southern Defensive Line had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent entity. Mannheim had fallen. Heidelberg was surrounded. American armor was racing east toward Würzburg and northeast toward Frankfurt, advancing not in line, but in columns, like spearheads driving into undefended territory. Entire German divisions disintegrated, their men walking west with white flags improvised from undershirts and pillowcases, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than continue fighting a battle that had already been lost. The Wehrmacht situation maps in those days show blue arrows, representing American advances, slicing through German positions like knives through paper. Commanders who tried to organize counterattacks found their units had evaporated before orders could be executed. Communication with Berlin became sporadic, then impossible, as American forces cut rail lines and telephone cables. The Southern Front had retreated. It had dissolved. On March 25th, 10 days after the first crossing, American reconnaissance elements reached positions over 60 miles inland. The Rhine was behind them, irrelevant now. The West Wall fortifications were bypassed, isolated, or destroyed. The southern approach to Germany lay open, and beyond it, the path to Austria, to Czechoslovakia, to the final encirclement of what remained of the Reich. In 10 days, the Americans had accomplished what would have taken months in the Great War, if it could have been accomplished at all. German military theorists, in the years after the war, would struggle to explain what happened. The Southern collapse became a case study in the obsolescence of traditional defensive strategy in the face of overwhelming material superiority and operational tempo. The fortifications hadn't been poorly designed. The soldiers hadn't been cowards. The tactics weren't fundamentally flawed. But none of it mattered when the enemy could cross a major river in force, sustain operations deep in hostile territory without pause, replace losses faster than they occurred, and maintain an operational tempo that allowed no time for defense to stabilize. The Americans had brought a different kind of war to Germany, one where abundance replaced maneuver as a decisive factor, where the question wasn't how to win battles, but how to sustain industrial-scale operations indefinitely. That rationed tin, discarded by the side of German roads in the thousands, represented something more profound than food. It represented a nation that could feed its soldiers better in the field than German civilians ate at home. It represented an economy that could produce not just weapons, but everything needed to sustain modern war, in quantities that made waste acceptable. It represented a democracy that had mobilized its entire productive capacity, farms, factories, mines, refineries, without collapsing under the strain, without starving its people, without requiring slaves or conquered territories to function. Every tin thrown away was a small announcement. We have so much we can afford to be careless with it. The transformation in German understanding was irreversible. Soldiers who believed in the invincibility of the fatherland, in the superiority of German military science, in the inevitability of final victory, sat in prisoner cages and confronted a reality their ideology had no space for. They had been told that democracies were weak, that American soldiers were soft, that a nation of mongrels and capitalists could never match the fighting spirit of the Reich. Instead, they had been defeated not by superior soldiers, but by superior everything else. Better logistics, better equipment, better food, better medical care, better communications, better organization. They had fought valiantly and lost anyway, because courage meant nothing against an enemy that could simply deliver more violence to more places more often than any defense could withstand. The Rhine crossing and the subsequent 10-day collapse of the Southern Front was not the largest battle of the European War. It was not the bloodiest. But it was perhaps the most symbolically devastating to the German military psyche because it revealed the utter futility of further resistance. After March 25, 1945, every German soldier knew at some level that the war was over. Some fought on from fanaticism or fear of retribution. Some died in the rubble of cities that had no strategic value. But the illusion that Germany could still win or even force a negotiated peace died on the banks of the Rhine in those 10 days when the Americans demonstrated that they could do the impossible and make it look routine. In the end, the river flowed on, indifferent. The concrete bunkers remained, empty monuments to a defeated strategy. And across the landscape of southern Germany, scattered in ditches and fields and forest clearings, thousands of small tin cans rusted slowly in the rain. Silent markers of the day abundance defeated ideology. When a democracy's industrial might prove that some wars cannot be won through courage alone, and that sometimes the side with the most factories wins simply because the other side runs out of everything else first. The truth, carried forward from that march into history, was simple and terrible. No fortification is impregnable when the enemy can bring unlimited force to bear. No defensive line holds when the enemy attacks everywhere at once. And no nation, however disciplined its soldiers or brilliant its generals, can win a modern war without the farms and factories to sustain it. The Rhine had been crossed. Germany's southern door had been kicked in, and 10 days was all it took to prove that the outcome had never really been in doubt.